Yeah, good morning to all the participants and a warm welcome from the Department of English Studies at Akal University, Talwandi Sabo. Welcome to this wonderful series of lectures that we have initiated since a year back uh, when the pandemic started. And it has turned out to be a wonderful set of scholars who have shared their experiences. And in that series, we started having them on Thursdays, and so we call them the Thursday webinar series. And one of the top linguists of India today is among us, and has honored us with his scholarship. And Dr. Niladri Shikhar Dash is our speaker for today. So let me take this privilege to welcome him and also accord a welcome address as the head of the department. So Dr. Niladri Shikhar Dash is professor and head of the Linguistic Research Unit at Indian Statistical Institute, Kolkata. So his major works are in the areas of corpus linguistics and language technology, in which he is a world-renowned expert in language documentation and digitization, computational lexicography, computer-assisted language teaching, digital ethnography, and dementia of bilingual aphasic patients, as well as in morphosyntax. He is an international visiting fellow of the British Academy of the United Kingdom, a visiting research scientist at the University of Reading, and a visiting scholar of the Language and Brain Laboratory at the University of Oxford. He has many accolades to his credit and has published very highly acclaimed research books from international publishers and 280 plus research papers in national and international journals, anthologies, conference proceedings, and travels very wide and far to deliver his academic lectures and teaching courses to more than 40 universities across India as well as internationally. So I take this opportunity again to welcome you, sir, for accepting our invitation to deliver your lecture. And without further ado, I would yield the floor to you. And Dr. Dash will speak to us about interlanguage, understanding the concept and its implications in second language acquisition. Over to you, Professor Dash.
Thank you very much. So, good morning to all my participants in today's talk and today's discussion. Before I start formally with my academic discussions here, there are certain issues of formalities. So, I'm really humbled, and it's a great honor for me that I have been invited by Akal University, Bhatinda, Punjab, to give a talk in this area. And for this, I would like to record and express my sincere thanks to Dr. Shantanu Ghosh, who is in charge of the head of the department, and the university, the administration of the university, the vice chancellor, honorable vice chancellor of the university, and many other people who have been involved in this particular series of lectures being organized by the department, and the technical team who have been involved here. Also, I express my sincere gratitude to all the participants who are present here to take part in the present discussions on this particular issue of interlanguage. So before I start, let me confess certain things very clearly. I have been asked recently by some universities in India to prepare some course materials for the master's level, particularly in the area of ELT, with the help of computer science. That means the course would be similar that of CALL, CALL, Computer Assisted Language Learning, or CALT, Computer Assisted Language Teaching. So while I was trying to prepare those course materials, in fact, I was assigned with 8 modules. It's a very big one. Each module having nearly 8,000 to 10,000 words. For last 1 year, I have been thoroughly studying various aspects about ELT and second language acquisition. And since I have been working in this area for a pretty long time with regard to application of computer science and knowledge and corpus in entire process of language teaching, first and second language teaching, I was more interested to understand the cognitive process of interlanguage. So while I was preparing the whole materials, I thought that, in fact, I shared my ideas with Santanu to that, okay, I have got some ideas about these things, very preliminary ideas although. So why not let me share those ideas with the audience and have their feedbacks, have their suggestions, so that we ourselves through discussions get enriched on the whole concept. Because as you know that this is a very challenging concept, a new concept in the entire scheme of language education. And Shantanu also agreed happily, and we thought that, okay, we will be going to discuss the various aspects and issues related to interlanguage. But in the meantime, I must also share that I received several phone calls and messages across the globe to highlight some other recent studies related to interlanguage and strong criticisms or limitations of interlanguage. And also the people, scholars across the world, I would mention it later on, how they have shared their ideas with me, and how I have been quite enriched with their conceptual ideas. But since this is basically a talk trying to understand the basic concept and its implication on second language acquisition, I won't be more critical, or I won't refer to those critical views which has been recently raised, but I'll give some ideas to them so that we can understand, okay, there are many other areas or aspects related to these particular theoretical framework, which also needs more careful attention. So this talk would be primarily a discussion, or rather I should say I'm also a learner trying to understand the concepts and its implications, sharing my concepts with you and getting your feedback to enrich all of us in the domain. So here the title is Interlanguage, Understanding the Concept and its Implication in Second Language Acquisition. The first question is, what is interlanguage? That has been a very real crucial issue for us. So this is, we have known the concept of language, but we are not much aware about the concept of interlanguage. What does this mean? This has been quite a concept or quite challenge for many of us. So let us understand stage by stage, what do we understand by the concept interlanguage? This is a new term. So let us start. Larry Celinca, one of the renowned psycholinguists, PWS, introduced the idea of interlanguage in 1972 in his article. So he builds this concept on Pitt Carter's article, The Significance of Learners' Errors, which was published in 1967. So you can find out that when the concept of interlanguage is being developed, there were some ideas also before the concept of interlanguage was introduced. And the seeds, the whole concept was there, learners' errors. And as we are the students of linguistics, or anybody and everybody who is using a language, who we know very clearly that the entire process of learning a language, either it is a first language or a second language or a third language, whatever language, there are errors. Learners invariably make errors. Pitt Carter, in his article, tried to understand the significance why learners make errors. And is there any strategy, any method, any theoretical framework based on which we can classify, understand, conceptualize those errors, and give a rationalistic approach in understanding the significance of errors in the whole process of learning? So the interlanguage actually evolved from the seeds of errors learners make. So somebody says it is errors, but Celinca, the great scholar, was not interested to say them error in the typical traditional concept a behavioristic model, or application, a structural model. Rather, he gives an interpretation a different way. So the interlanguage is basically not exactly error, something else, which has some components, some features of interlanguage. The principle behind interlanguage is that the language of SL learners, that is second language learners, is governed by systematic rules, and these rules are different from those of the language being learned, L2, and from those of the learner's native language. So you can find out that there are three stages. So, article says interlanguage says that it's governed, rule governed issue, and these rules are different from the second language which the learners are learning, as well as it is different from the first language, the mother tongue or native language of the learner. It is in between something. We'll give a schematic representation of this later on. We'll come across. At every stage of second language learning, learners do not merely copy what native speakers do, but they create an entirely new language system unique to themselves. So it is a new system, according to Celinca. It's a new system which is unique, having some stray references, stray similarities with the native language structure or the second language structure, but characteristically, this is different. Celinca named this interim language system, that is interlanguage, interim period, as you know that there is a kind of concept interim in between. He proposes that interlanguage has all the normal properties of natural language, and interlanguage is systematic and bound by rules in the same manner as unnatural languages. So his claim is very clear that it is a similar kind of natural language, and all the linguistic features, characteristics which we normally come across for a natural language is also present in interlanguage. Interlanguage is based on three basic principles. Number one is overgeneralization. That means overgeneralization of the patterns found in the language being learned, that is language 2. And it also has the property of transfer from parents' patterns found in learner's native language. So also transfer some patterns which has been noted in the L1. And fossilization, the phenomenon of learner's language ceasing to develop. At a particular point, after a particular point, the learners cease to develop further. And this stage is known as fossilization stage. So interlanguage is learners' present knowledge of SL, language 2, they are learning. It is an interim grammar constructed by learners. So learners themselves construct it when they start learning SL, not before that. On their way to the target language, and interlanguage is an immediate intermediate status of a learner system between their native language or mother tongue and the target language. So this is the concept, basic concept, which has been proposed by Celinca. He has also identified certain features, certain properties, certain uniqueness, certain functionalities, and other characteristics. I will discuss one by one. This is the father. Here is a picture taken from Wikipedia with full acknowledgement. He's still alive at the age of 84 years. Larry Celinca is Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at University of Michigan and former director of the university's English Language Institute. In 1972, he introduced interlanguage, which becomes the foundation of modern research into second language acquisition. Interlanguage is accepted as a basic principle. So you can find out that how much impact it has made. And whoever, any learner or any professional or teacher who is involved in the area of research and academics related to second language teaching are more or less aware about the concept. And we are the students of linguistics. We are also trying to understand how Celinca proposes the whole thing and how it enriches our understanding of the whole process of language learning, both first language and second language, how, as well as how new methods are being introduced or new concepts are actually interlinked with interlanguage to understand the processes and the phenomena. Understanding the basic concepts of interlanguage. Here we'll try to understand, based on the definitions, we'll try to understand the basic concept of interlanguage. So interlanguage is a term for a linguistic system. It speaks about a system that underlies a learner's language. That is, It is a property of the learner. Only learner, when he or she starts learning a second language, the entire process of interlanguage is invoked, not before that. We can find this system when a learner tries to use a learner's language in unrehearsed communication. So he triggers, he activates this system, particularly when in an unrehearsed process situation, he tries to communicate in the second language he's learning. It is slightly different from error analysis. In error analysis, we look at learner's language in terms of deviance from the norms of the target language. So in cases of errors, we identify error as a deviation from the norm, from the standards of the target language, and we call them deviance as error. So we identify them as error. In interlanguage analysis, we look at the same language, learner language, but from a different perspective. We don't call them error. Here we try to understand the kind of system the learners might be using to produce the patterns we observe them to use in unrehearsed communication. So rather than calling them as errors, we identify, okay, this is a new phenomenon, a new system which is triggered, which is invoked, which is initiated by the learners. And we want to make his communication, unrehearsed communication, a successful event. And we want to understand. From a functional perspective, interlanguage is viewed as a transitional linguistic system. It's an interim stage, so it has to be transitional, which different in form from target language system and learner's native language system. So this transitional linguistic system is characteristically different from the language system which the learner is going to learn, as well as his or her native language system, that is NLS. So interlanguage works at all levels of the second language learning. So the simple question, what does it work? So it works in all processes. So you know that the entire process of learning, either first language or second language, involves several stages, like say processing, generation, accumulation, incubation. A lot of stages are involved. So here, and also linguistic, there are multiple layers like phonology, morphology, syntax, semantic, discourse, pragmatics, grammar, and other properties, communication activities. So all those cases, all those stages, these three structure or these interlanguage structure actually operates at all levels of a language learning mechanism. We can describe interlanguage in terms of evolving linguistic patterns and norms, and explain it in terms of specific cognitive and sociolinguistic processes that shape up the system. So we have two weapons in our hand, that in terms of evolvement, we can identify those patterns, how they are evolved, how they're developed, and also we can identify the specific cognitive and psycholinguistic mechanism processes are actually involved in the whole process and how those elements actually contribute to shape of the system. So here we have to make a distinction, how error analysis versus interlanguage analysis. So let us understand that although the concept of interlanguage actually developed in 1916, the seventh paper of Pitt Carter on error analysis, significance of error analysis, how this is actually characteristically different from error analysis. So here I have tried to make a distinction between the two pairs to show how they differ. In cases of error analysis is concerned with the compilation, study, and analysis of errors made by SL learners and aims at investigating aspects of SL language acquisition or second language acquisition. So in purpose of error analysis, we try to understand, to compile data, errors, study errors, analyze errors, to identify that what kind of mistakes or errors are actually made. Okay, there are some characteristic difference between mistakes and errors. So I won't say mistakes, it's an error. And try to investigate the aspects of the SL language, how those issues are actually play a role in language acquisition. In interlanguage analysis, believes that SL learning or second language process is influenced by learners L1, interlanguage, and the target language. The gap between interlanguage and target language is wide. So you have to understand that this is not error. It's a new stage, which is called interlanguage, an interim stage, which is different from target analysis. So analysis says, while in error analysis, the perspective is that how the errors are made. In interlanguage, it says we want to understand how this stage is actually developed, how this phrase is actually developed, and how it is characteristically different from the target language. Error analysis tells us that a learner makes a lot of errors in marking, say, for instance, agreement features in English. So how the learner makes errors in marking out the grammatical features of a particular language or target language. Interlanguage analysis shows a system where some grammatical agreement patterns are invoked for all. So rather than being one grammatically unique grammatical pattern is actually invoked to address all other varieties available in the target language. Grammatical agreement feature results in some errors, say for third person singular tense, but the learner may not use that s. He goes or he go or she go. So grammatical error analysis that there is a mistake, there is an error which has been made by the learner. But interlanguage say, no, this is a new pattern. More other common pattern, that is first language, first person singular form is the present. The same pattern is actually extended to the third person. So it is basically one grammar seemingly accepted form, a pattern is extended to other. It is not an error. So this is a unique pattern which you notice. It is not error, but these patterns maybe are useful for the learner to make a successful communication the learners are trying to make. These are the outcomes of improper training or wrong assimilation of the part of the learners. So error analysis that, okay, these errors are basically improper training, or maybe the learners has wrongly assimilated the ideas. Cognitive processes of overgeneralization leads to creation of this pattern, a typical feature. Interlanguage says, no, this is basically overgeneralization. A pattern which is specific for a particular type is generalized for other patterns also. So it's basically an event of overgeneralization rather than being improper training or wrong assimilation. Error is a revelation of the process of SL learning, a feature of language learning. So error says that if you learn a language, you are bound to make some errors. And you have to correct those errors to improve your skill in second language. In interlanguage, it says error is an aspect of interlanguage. It's not a deficiency. It's a unique aspect which is produced by SL or FL learners. So this is an important criteria. It is not a deficiency, that it should be analyzed from this purpose. Number 5, learners' errors as viewed in interlanguage. So how interlanguage, we are giving that how interlanguage actually trying to view the errors. In second language learning, learner errors are caused by several processes. We know very well. Those who have studied data or actually investigated some data produced by the learners, they can find out that there are a lot of errors. And you can classify those errors from conceptually, structurally, linguistically, or using many other issues. But here in interlanguage, it is perspectively used from purely linguistic perspective, says that some errors are caused borrowing patterns from the native language, which are actually noted because of influence of the native language, that is transfer, extending patterns from the target language, maybe some extensions of overgenerational patterns, and expressing meaning using words and grammar which are already known, and trying to express those ideas with the existing knowledge rather than acquiring some new one. So these are the basic 3 types for interlanguage. Interlanguage argues that a SL learner system is a separate system which has a structurally intermediate status between NL and TL. It is neither the system of NL nor the system of target language, but it falls in between the two. It is a system that is based upon the best attempt of learners to provide order and structure to the linguistic stimuli surrounding it. See, this is very crucial issue, important aspect, that the learner tries to give a structure, a pattern, so that he or she can assimilate them, overgeneralize them, extend them, and make them frequently used. based on different requirements in his or her day-to-day linguistic surroundings when he or she is trying to interact in language 2, he or she is learning. By a gradual process of trial, error, and hypothesis testing, learners slowly and gradually, but tediously, succeed in establishing closer and closer approximations to the system used by native speakers of target language. So, the growth in capacity and competence in interlanguage doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. And learners does some corrections, trials, modifications, changes, hypothesis testing, then gradually, slowly, as well as in a tedious process. Because learning itself is a very complex, tedious process. He goes clear, closer and closer and near to the level where he or she can acquire some amount of communicative skill, a linguistic skill, competence, nearer to the native learners or native language speakers of the target language. Based on Celinca's view, we say that interlanguage refers to a systematic knowledge of L2, which is independent of both L1 and L2. So some new dimensions are actually added to interlanguage. It says, in recent times, we have come across interlanguage has come to be used with different but related meanings. So it is not only related to the analysis of error or defining the intermediate stages or interim stages the learners follow in developing the skills or his competence in the second language. It also speaks about some other aspects not related to error analysis. To refer to the series of interlocking systems which characterize acquisitions, it finds it like a chain that there are several small systems which are interlinked by this interlanguage. To refer to the system observed at a single stage of development as an interlink, not only that in the series of stages, but at the individual stages of development that also can be judged. To refer to a particular L1, L2 combinations, that is also another. How L1 and L2 are actually combined and what are the characteristics are actually generated when L1 and L2 combine. Say, for example, L1 is Hindi, L2 is English, or L1 is Bengali and L2 is English. In that kind of situations, what kind of combinations are actually taking place? We can also have some reflections, some ideas or understanding of that particular stage also. Celinca suggests that interlanguage as a transitional phase between L1 and L2 is observable in a learner's language and can be explored. This is a question which has been critically discussed or critically analyzed or critically viewed in later years. But in Celinca's argument that it is possible by looking at the data produced by the learners, it is possible to understand what kind of stages they actually belong. He also considers interlanguage as a dialect whose rules share characteristics of two social dialects of languages, whether these languages themselves share rules or not. So another dimension added to interlanguage is that it can be treated as a dialect. As a linguist, we know that dialect is also an independent language of its own claim. So also interlanguage has some properties similar to that of a dialect, although it does not have. If you refer to the dialect continuum concepts introduced by Treadgill and Chambers in 1984 in his book on dialectology, you can also find out that that particular dialect continuum concept is also introduced here in cases of understanding the interlanguage. When we claim interlanguage is a separate dialect or independent language, having some similarities with L1 and L2, but not exactly the same. Here, Celinca's notion of interlanguage, you can find out the graphic representation. Here you say that the central circle is called interlanguage. And L1, that is native language of the learners, and L2 is the target language, the learners are learning. If you look at the picture, very simplified one, without going into far more complexities involved into it, you can find out that there are some common areas where L1 and IL actually overlap. And there are some areas where IL or interlanguage and L2 actually overlap. And these overlapping areas have certain properties of both interlanguage and L1 and interlanguage and L2. But L1 and L2 are actually different and they don't have any connection in between. And and L1 is an independent language having some features of L2. So this is basically a graphic representation, more simplified conceptualizations of the concept proposed by Celinca. You can understand where exactly the AIL or interlanguage stands. Now here, if you look at the Pitt-Carter's concept of learner's language, you can find out there is a difference. So only difference you can find out that here Pitt-Carter's circle is, I have taken it from 1981's paper, that Carter's notion of dialect and relation in language learning. You can find out, but this IL actually basically dialect relations. So Pitt-Carter argues that the set of rules in language A and set of rules of language B has certain common features, certain common area where actually this kind of area which is called IL or interlanguage. So the question is, if you look go back to the earlier model, there is a circle in between which is known as IL, and this particular circle is missing. So basic contribution of Celinca's model is that the Carter's concept don't recognize exactly IL. We have met at IL, but he says that L1 and L2 are actually closely related, which may not all the time happen. It may happen that you are learning a language which are completely different to each other. That is why we need a stage between called interlanguage stage, which we can have some common properties of L1 and L2. But in that case, in Carter's model, that particular intermediate locking systems or locking phase are actually missing. So Pitt-Carter argues that the learner's language could be considered as a dialect in the linguistic sense. He means that the two languages that share the same rules of grammar become a dialect. So you can also debate with this argument whether any two languages that share some common rules can be dialect or not. Based on his claim, he states that language A and language B are in a dialect relation, which leads to a generation of interlanguage. So this is a kind of concept which has been proposed, and you can find out that this is actually thematically and theoretically different from Celinca's interlanguage. The core assumptions underlying interlanguage, why the whole concept has to be generated. This is a basic argument that why this particular concept was necessary. Core assumptions underlying interlanguage said that second learning is a gradual process, progression from L1 to L2. I don't know whether all of us will believe, but I personally also believe this argument that learning a second language is a gradual progress. It's a gradual process. It's not that you develop your acumen, your skill in the second language overnight. Regular practice, regular exposure, regular training, and learning, careful learning, that can give you certain kind of skills or competence in the target language. This is a gradual process. At every stage of learning, a learner develops a system of rules that is neither the system of L1 nor the system of L2, but falls between the two, which has been time and again argued that. The process of second language learning consists of rule formation or hypothesis testing on the part of the learners. So whole process, in the process of learning, the learner is basically involved in the process of rule formation. He always forms rules, modifies rules, rectifies those rules, adds new information, changes the existing rules, and tests all his rules or hypotheses with data, and confirms. If it is assured, then it confirms. If it is new data comes across that this rule is not attested, he modifies it. So it is a continuous process of trial and error. Mistakes made by SL learners are a natural process of learning. So not only in L2, in L1 also, this is a very common feature that mistakes are there, bound to happen. Now, teachers who are involved in the whole process of language teaching can give appropriate feedback after checking learners' interlanguage. Learners need not worry much about mistakes. They must understand that making mistakes is a process of development from L1 to L2. So without making mistakes, learner can proceed. So it's mandatory, it's bound, it is obligatory, it's inevitable that learners must make mistakes. There is a psychological structure latent in the brain which is activated when a learner attempts to learn a second language. So it also brings us back to our generative framework of language learning, LAD and other aspects, and also Eric Lenneberg's model of biological systems of learning. So these issues also come into this picture because it says that there is a latent structure, psychological structure in the brain, which is actually triggered in the whole process of learning. A lot of new experiments has been carried out. Some experiments have claimed that, okay, this assumption may be partially true, but many recent assumptions studies also are not ready to accept this theory. But we are not going to go into this debate whether it is acceptable or not. But this has been assumed in interlanguage understanding that some psychological structure in the brain are actually invoked or triggered, activated in the whole process of learning. Many SL learners do not achieve the expected full competence. This is quite natural. Not that every learner who is learning a second language will learn in the same level. It varies from person to person, individual to individual, or learner to learner. And there are many reasons behind that. So main characteristics or observable facts of second language learning, interlanguage. There are 4 important characteristics. Number 1, stability. Learners use some rules of interlanguage for a longer period of time. The many important characteristics that some rules are quite stable, are preserved by learners for a longer time. Systematicity, rules that learners acquire in interlanguage are quite systematic and are more or less regular. Mutual intelligibility, learners of different languages can interchange ideas with interlanguage and can understand each other. Actually, it is not directly interacting with the teachers, rather interacting with the peers or with other people who are learning also second language. When they communicate, they have a mutual level of intelligibility. Then there is black sliding, linguistic mastery of some level in target language learned by learners through use, loss, non-use, misuse of verbs. So there are a lot of processes actually involved, psychological processes, which are identified as black sliding. First characteristic is stability. It is a feature that shows consistency in using certain rules or form over a long period of time. That means using the same form twice or more by the same learners. Learners use some rules quite frequently. Scholars argue that it is not acceptable that a new language hypothesis is needed to explain the human tendency to keep making the same errors and mistakes and to learn things gradually. So scholars also argue that it is not acceptable because that all the time all the learners generate the new rules or new tendencies, rather to make mistakes corrected. So when they learn things gradually, they use certain rules quite normal way or regular way in a very stable manner. This feature becomes less impactful when we find that we difference between 2 types of interlanguage users. Type 1 is associated with those whose interlanguage is distinguished by stability, and type 2 is characterized by instability. There are some learners have preserved some of those rules for a longer period of time, so stability is more prominent feature for them. For other learners, this is not true. They don't preserve them for a longer period of time, so these are unstable for them. The problem arises in the context of deciding to which type a learner's interlanguage belongs to. So now, some learners preserve them, some learners don't preserve them. So it becomes very crucial for us, the teacher or experimenter or researcher, to identify that who are actually preserving them. So in practice, it is not easy to identify which learners or who are actually preserving them and who are having more stable features among them. So we need to do a lot of experiments to find out. Second characteristic is systematicity. It says that interlanguage is characterized as being systematic and not a random collection of rules or items. It follows a particular system of rules, which makes it systematic. So it is systematic, regular, synchronized. Although the rules are not essentially the same as the rule of the target language, it has a specific set of rules that are required by SL learners. So these rules, which are acquired by learners or preserved by learners, are not same to the target language, but it is unique. It is unique because it has some specific functions for the target learners, and learners require them when they use L2. Despite variability in interlanguage, it is possible to detect the rule-based nature of a learner's use of L2. It is argued that L2 speech of learners can be called systematic when it reveals an internal consistency in the use of forms at a single point in time. So when you find out that those rules are systematically, consistently being used in different situations, we can say that this is a pattern, this is a rule already been developed. Scholars, however, argue that when a second language a student learns the first language, a foreign language, he or she uses a smaller range of styles than the styles that are being used native speakers. That's quite natural. So the whole range of new styles, new grammatical varieties, which are very much prominent in cases of first language speakers of the target language, cannot be expected from the learners. So they have a limited access, limited set of rules, limited set of patterns, but these are there. And native speakers' range of styles are more and varied compared to the L2 learners who have just achieved a few rules and styles command at his reach. Such a learner has more styles in his natural language or his native language, which is the L1. He has already acquired and is familiar with. So even these interlanguage rules are far less than the target language and equally far less than the native language, but it is there. So I should go first because time is too short. I have so many slides. Now, third is characteristics mutual intelligibility. It speaks about that mutual intelligibility is the relationship between dialects and languages in which speakers of different dialects or languages to some extent interchange or understand each other without external effort. Interlanguage is used for the sake of communication among the speakers. So speakers can share different functions of communication with natural languages also. Mutual intelligibility among languages can be systematic also. There are differences. It is an inherent feature of interlanguage, which makes the speakers to become members of the human language. So interlanguage is not that every learner has the same pattern. There is symmetry in cases of learners. So somebody will learn more patterns or some unique patterns which are missing in others. If SL learners are able to communicate verbally in languages rather than they are in their natural language or native language, they are fit to be able to share an interlanguage and are considered to be efficient in it. If they fail to communicate with other languages, they are considered to possess the NL grammar more that blocks the emergence of the interlanguage. If they fail to communicate, it assumes that their mother tongue or their native tongue and native language actually blocking for the emergence of interlanguage or activation of interlanguage. It is crucial to see if a learner is up the one first language class is able to communicate with understand another learner from another class being taught in the same target second language. If this is found to be so, then learners are considered to have reached at interlanguage stage, and if not, they are assumed not to have it. So the fourth characteristic is backsliding. That is very clear or common for us. It refers to a linguistic mastery of a certain form in the target language by learners, followed by loss, non-use, or misuses of forms. So all SL learners and teachers are familiar with this phenomenon. Fossilized forms or structures continue to occur despite error corrections. Fossilized forms means some forms are so stereotyped, so fossilized in the brain of the learners that even if they are corrected, they make repeat those errors, quite common. Explicit grammatical instructions or explanations. And even if these are corrected or eradicated, they might occur again in a spontaneous production. Such a phenomenon is called the block sliding. So backsliding is in the feature is that some errors which has been rectified, corrected, and eradicated from the learner's brain or learner system, still it occur at certain situations. So it backslides, come back and slides back into the discourse. Celinca argues that backsliding is neither haphazard nor toward a speaker's NL, but is toward an interlanguage norm. He states that backsliding may happen when an L2 learner focuses on meaning and makes or produces a formerly learned interlanguage form. So it is more tilted toward meaning rather than the structure or grammatical properties. And when a learner tries to repeat it, it happens. In cases of fossilization, no alternative rule of target language is available to learner. Whereas In cases of backsliding, there is always an alternative rule. But because of some contextual and emotional factors, learners fail to use this in right alternative rule appropriately. That is why they make backsliding. In backsliding, learners have some intuitions about the correct rule or fall. They know, they have clear some intuitions about it. Whereas in cases of fossilization, learners do not have that kind of rule or form preserved. This implies that backsliding is an evidence of a function in the interlanguage that has lost its permeability. Permeability means permeating into other levels. So here we talk about the interlanguage continuum. During L2 acquisition, SL learners formulate hypotheses about the system or rules of the target language. Until and unless they form hypotheses, they cannot proceed. These rules are viewed as mental grammars, and that construct the interlanguage system. These mental grammars are permeable. They are exposed to influences both from the outside the learner and from the learner's internal processing. So it is coming from both outside, from environment exposed to the situations, as well as from the internal processing normally done by the learners. It suggests that learner's performance is variable, and these mental grammars are by nature transitional. And since it is variable, they transit from one point to another at different stages of learning. A learner changes his grammar from one time to another by adding rules, deleting those rules, restructuring the whole system. So you can find out that internal processing mechanism actually operate in the process of learning. Learner continuously does processing with the data or information or patterns or rules to increase its capability in the whole process of learning. So there is a continuum process actually continues. At every stage of learning, there is an interlanguage. Through the gradual process of checking and rechecking hypothesis, learner keeps changing his interlanguage until the target language system is fully acquired or set up. So the gradual progression naturally implies to an interlanguage continuum, which has been represented. I show this structure. This is called the interlanguage continuum. So it says that starting from 0 to 10 to 50 to 90 100%, that is on the left hand side is the target language, L1 of the learner, and from 0 to 900, this whole phase is basically interlanguage phase. So the target of the learner is to reach to the 100%, that is L2 stage. So at every stage, this is a continuum process that gradually he passes through several sub-stages, sub-locking systems, which through his continuous process of processing the idea or information or patterns or rules or data which has been available, both from internal, from outside data or teachings from the teachers, as well as his own process of assimilations of data and information, ultimately leads to this. But one must understand that this interlanguage continuum is basically a theoretical construct, in the sense that it may not happen that many of the learners may not reach to the stage of 100%. They can stop in between this whole process because of fossilization and many other issues involved into it. So it shows that the above figure suggests that interlanguage is a dynamic phenomenon. It's a very dynamic one, continuously changes over time, which can be illustrated with a continuum, which is one for the L1 and the other is L2. The SL learner constantly moves along the interlanguage continuum on this line with a view on the destination that is complete mastery in the target language. So whether all the learners would be reaching to 100% stage or the full-fledged stage of target language is a crucial issue. It's an unpredictable issue that cannot be. But theoretically, it is possible that starting from 0 to 100%, this whole length continuum can be covered by some careful learners. So now language devices which are used in interlanguage. Interlanguage proceeds by adopting two types of mechanisms, that language devices. One is called L1 mechanism, the mechanism that are used in first language acquisition. and alternative mechanism, that mechanisms that are used in learning SL2. So we find there are two mechanisms actually involved or incorporated or invoked into the system, L1 mechanism or alternative or L2 mechanism. The L1 mechanism has two important parts. L1 learners utilize the same mechanisms as L1 learners used during language acquisition. So in cases of language acquisition, we use two important stages. One is called mechanism universal grammar or UG, postulated by Chomsky. It asserts that there are certain principles that all possible natural languages have. These principles are biologically determined and specialized for language learning. Although we know that there are many new theories or critical comments on this idea, since we are not going into that kind of complexities involved in first language acquisition, we just mention that it has been mentioned in interlanguage study. And second one is latent language structure, LLS. This is a counterpart of universal grammar. It is proposed by Eric Lenneberg in Biological Foundations of Language in 1972. It assumes that a child's brain has innate propensity for language acquisition, and that this propensity is lost as maturation takes place. Again, this has been criticized by scholars. I'm not going into that kind of criticisms here because this is not relevant. For us, we have to keep these two issues in mind, that these are considered relevant or important for us. These theories are associated with L1 acquisitions. These are adopted by researchers of the SL acquisitions to provide explanations for the existence of development sequences in interlanguage and to view L2 acquisitions as a natural process. So there is called another alternative mechanism. Along with the universal grammar and latent language structure, the L2 mechanism, the language learners also use another mechanism which is called latent psychological structure, that is LPS, that is alternative mechanism. Celinca argues that 5% of L2 learners attain mastery in target language by using the latent language structure, that is LLS, while 95% of L2 learners achieve competence in target language by using latent psychological structures. So Celinca agrees with the concepts that the first model or L1 model and L2 model are actually both are used in understanding the interlanguage stage, both does, but I have no idea how we measure it for 5% and 95%. But this is that both has some role to play in interlanguage acquisition. So difference between LPS, language psychological, latent psychological structure, and latent language structure. LPS has no direct genetic timetable, no subject to a critical period, as it has been proposed in LLS. LPS has no direct connection with any grammatical concept or universal grammar. LPS has no guarantee of activation or realization into particular grammar structures of L2. So these are the how he differentiates that the LPS, that is psychological structure, is different from latent language structure in that way. Although these devices are considered to be independent, it is possible that possible overlaps may occur between these structures and other areas of brain. So perhaps Celinca keeps the door open to explore further, to see that if LPS actually characteristically different from LLS, and how we should interpret LPS to understand the interlanguage. Now, three notions of latent psychological structures. He further explicates the three notions are competent of the latent psychological structures. Number one is fossilization, psycholinguistic process, and human cognition in acquisition. I'll explain also a little bit. That fossilization, when SL learners stop progressing any further, that I have already mentioned in continuum, in the whole process of learning the target language. In psycholinguistic processes, the psycholinguistic processes operating in the mind of the L2 learners determine the nature and degree of fossilization. What kind of psycholinguistic processes are involved actually determines the nature or degree of fossilizations will take place. And human cognition acquisition, the developmental sequences in SL acquisition results from the cognitive processes in the learner's brain. That for the first time, the mental processes, the cognitive processes are given tremendous importance in language learning. That has a tremendous impact, which we'll focus on in the later slides. Now, fossilizations is Celinca's recognized fossilization an important mechanism of latent psychological structure, or LPS. He assumes that many SL learners will not achieve the total mastery in L2. Rather, they'll stop somewhere in the middle, with their language still being affected by errors. So it's not that everybody will reach to the target, to the goal, to the destination. Some are bound to stop or destined to stop in between. Fossilization can take place at any stage of a learning process, very quite natural, even at a very early stage of learning also. According to him, out of all the L2 learners, nearly 5% are thoroughly successful as to be able to reach to the end of interlanguage continuum, as has been defined there, to 100% mastery in the L2. When learners stop progressing any further, their interlanguage is said to have been in a state of fossilization. The moment learners stop learning second language or acquiring efficiency in the second language, their interlanguage stage comes to an end, stops. Successful learners do not fossilize, rather, they constantly move along the interlanguage continuum to reach to the destination. In cases of psycholinguistic processes, it has 4 important characteristics. Overgeneralization, that fossilization happens due to overuse of L2 rules, that many learners use L2 rules quite frequently, overgeneralize to other patterns in those contexts where these are not at all required. Transfer of training, that is, fossilization occurs due to certain features found in instruction via which learners are taught in the L2. So sometimes when the instructions given in the particular language, that particular language can also have some properties, transfer of training. Strategies of second language learning. Fossilization occurs due to the application of some approaches to learning of L2 material adopted by the learners. Fossilization occurs due to some approaches used by the learners when communicating with the N2 speakers, native speakers. And fossilization happens due to the influence of the L1 in the process of learning. So you can find out that entire process of fossilization has 5 important stages or 5 areas which actually have an effect in the whole process of learning. So here you can find out for the fossilization process, I have simplified the process taken from the Krzyzewski of 1997's model. Here you can find out that this is the interlanguage stage, and this is the L1 stage, and this is the L2 stage. You can find out the right hand side, and here are 5 important stages. So you can find out that transfer of training from target language, which comes number 2, is actually overgeneralization of number 1, overgeneralization of target rules, which is affecting the interlanguage fossilization part. Some rules which has been transferred from L2, which also affects the interlanguage part, fossilization part. Strategies which are used by in the whole process of learning on the part of the learners that can be have an effect on the interlanguage, and strategies the learners use while they are trying to communicate with the second language speakers, native speakers of the second language. They can have also some strategies which can have some effect into this. And lastly, the components, the rules, the patterns of L1 of the learners can have some effect. So there are 5 major domains which can have some effect, the fossilization determining processes on the part of the interlanguage. Now, human cognition acquisition. This is an important part, third part, that is psychological aspects of human cognition. The second language researchers believe that the developmental sequences in second language acquisition result from the cognitive process in the learner's brain. So we are now giving importance on the cognitive processes, cognitive patterns, psychological processes in language acquisition, second language acquisition. Language processing is an inbuilt process that all human beings can be expected to use whenever they learn. So it is not a particular individual perspective or in your society's perspective. Every individual has that particular part, and they can trigger, they can activate, they can utilize that particular part or process a brain or cognitive process in the cases of learning. Either it is learning the first language or the second language. Recent researches now suggest that it is common and natural for L2 learners to form the overgeneralized rules at first for further use in context. So recent studies has revealed that many of the recent studies have also revealed that, okay, even in second language learning also, overgeneralization is a very common feature on the part of the learners. They do it because they assume that maybe that particular rule can be extended for other patterns or can be utilized or can be applied in new contexts when they interact. There are developmental sequences that SL learners are expected to move through on their own if they are provided with adequate input in the language. So there is a development process. Learners can move further the moment they get more inputs in the whole process of learning. SL learners need opportunity to use target language to communicate. They also need the situation, actual situations, practical situations, physical situations, while they can utilize their language, their learning. Moreover, they need corrective feedbacks from more knowledgeable users also. So they need that whether they have been successful enough to use rightly, that also is required certification or support or knowledgeable support from mostly from the first language learners or their instructors or the teachers, so that they get more encouraged to learn that they are actually using the language in a proper way. Research results support that Crowder's 1967 model, construct the learner's built-in syllabus, has some gains in the process of second language acquisitions. So 67's model, significance of errors, has the Crowder has categorically mentions about the some built-in syllabus, some component syllabus is already developed as a form of a dialect on the part of the learners, and that has a role in cases of language acquisitions also. That is also approved here in human cognition, the acquisition process. Now, the basic theory or strength of the interlanguage theory, it says, so interlanguage theory is basically systematic and universal by nature. Like the inner theory of L1 acquisition, it considers second language learners as active participators, since they are capable of constructing rules from the data they encounter or from the rules or information or data provided to them by the teachers or the environment they're exposed to in the whole process of learning. If we accept the concept of interlanguage, it helps us to determine what SL learners already know at a certain point of his time and what they have to be taught, when and how in a particular SL teaching program. So this gives an advantage to us that we exactly know at what stage the learners are and what kind of additional support, new data, new information, new grammars, new rules to be taught them so that they acquire more confidence, more competence in the language. The acceptance of this concept of interlanguage has liberated many language teaching methods. So the impact of interlanguage is that the many existing processes of language teaching are quite liberated. Now, it paves the way of communicative language teaching, so that language teaching is no more confined in a grammar translation method or instructive method, keeping the learners inside the class, rather putting the learners in a frame of communication, so that by using their interlanguage mechanism or structures or patterns, they can be successful in actual situations of communication. So making errors in SL language learning is considered as a natural part of a learning process. SL teachers are now ready to apply these teaching activities which do not require constant supervision on the learner's language. So once we accept the truth that making error is a part of the learning process, so teachers also accept this truth, and they are now less concerned about the corrections of these errors, making rectifications of these errors, rather accepting them as the patterns generated by the learners in the interlanguage stage and providing appropriate measures or remedial stages to the learners so that they can improve on those patterns and have far better insights. Acceptance of interlanguage also allows group works and paired works to become suitable or useful matters of SL learning. So mostly the concept of group works, that learners as researchers, learners as members of a team and reciprocal learning. And pair words, that the two or three male students or two learners are paired against each other in the whole process of learning. That becomes a common process in communicative approach. Now, weakness of the interlanguage theory. A major criticism of interlanguage relates its limited explanatory power. There has been questions, even modern ages, and I'll just mention some of these. That recently I came across some articles also shared by some great scholars across the globe, particularly from US. They said that the power of explanation of the whole process of learning of second language is not clearly understood if I utilize interlanguage theory in understanding the kind of psychological framework, the psychological patterns developed with the learners. And that's true. So when we have understand the concept of language learning, we know that it is not only the linguistic process. There are many other issues actually involved. Some extra linguistic components, sociocultural issues, ecological issues, cultural factors, discursive elements, and many other properties are actually come into play to make a second language learner far more competent in communication. So it says that interlanguage theory are actually emphasizing more only on linguistic aspects rather than focusing on other important components, aspects, properties, which are equally relevant in the entire process of second language learning. This theory assumes that linguistic stage that a learner belongs to is predictable by analyzing the errors. But this is not always true. Analyze errors is one thing, and based on the analysis error, to identify to which stage a particular learner lives or is there is always not possible. It's not so easy, so predictable one. In reality, error analysis as a mode of inquiry is limited to its scope. So when we analyze errors, we find out that what kind of errors are they making, what kind of remedial steps we should take. But that cannot actually determine to which stage of linguistic competence in second language a particular learner is. It concentrates on what the learners did wrong rather than what made them successful. So that has a negative implication that we're trying to identify what the learners has made the mistakes, not at exact kind of competence or level of competence the learners has acquired. It is often impossible to identify the unitary source of an error, as I've already mentioned, as there are several internal and external issues involved in making errors on the part of the learners. Learners' errors there are various reasons, various factors. If you go through this error analysis in second language learning, you can find out that there are many, many reasons. In fact, I recently studied that there are more than 30 different types or 30 different types of reasons behind making an error on the part of the learner while learning a second language. So it is not only the unitary one-dimensional one. So it is not always possible to say that interlanguage analysis or error analysis can predict that. So error analysis gives learners the required base of improvements on the interlanguage. But researchers confirm that too much correction can lead a lack of motivation and thereby leading many correct utterances to be unnoticed. The analysis, therefore, needs to be restricted to important error series. So too much of anything is very bad, the typical English proverb. So if you find all the errors of the learner part and you want to correct each and every learner, it may discourage a learner to learn a language. Rather, you have to identify the major types of error and rectify them, and believe the learners can do this according to their own ways in the whole process of learning in a communicative setting. The interlanguage theory cannot determine how the exact cognitive position of learners in between L1 and L2 will be explained and interpreted. So what kind of cognitive stage or cognitive position the learners actually acquire or have at the stage, it is not possible to identify from interlanguage. Now, the desired paradigm shift what we find here. Before 1960s, Language was considered as a behavioral pattern, phenomenon. Like other forms of human behavior, language was believed to be learned by the process of habit formation. Might have heard that the behavioristic model of Skinner's BF Skinner's model that has been strongly criticized by Chomsky and many others, and almost now ignored. In behavioristic theory, a child is assumed to learn his natural language or native language by imitating sounds and patterns he hears around him. By approval or disapproval, adult members reinforce a child's attempts and leads efforts to correct forms. This was the traditional model in 1950s, early 50s and 1960s, but after the introduction of interlanguage concept, the whole approach to language learning changed. Now it has been more of a cognitive process. After the introduction of interlanguage theory, language is now considered as a mental phenomenon, and language learning is visualized as a psychological, cognitive, or mental process rather than a behavioral one. In cognitive linguistics, explanation for L1 acquisition of behavioristic theory is severely criticized, that we have already known. Language cannot be verbal behavior only. It never happens. Children are able to produce an infinite number of utterances that they have never been heard before. This creativity is only possible because a child develops a system of rules and utilizes his psychological processes, utilizes his brain, his cognitive mechanism in the whole process of language learning and language utilization applications. Studies shows that children actually do construct their own rule system, which develops gradually until it corresponds to the systems of the adults. There is also evidence to prove that children pass through similar stages, acquiring grammatical rules also in a particular language or the second language also. So this paradigm shift from behavioristic model to structural model to cognitive model has been a major contribution of interlanguage. We now started looking at the whole process of language learning, second language learning, mostly from cognitive perspective rather than a behavioral model. Impact of the interlanguage theory. I'm coming near to the end, so maybe one more slide is there. What is the impact of the interlanguage theory? The concept of interlanguage has had a major and lasting impact in second language learning. Studies on interlanguage has often focused on linguistic and psychological aspects of second language learning researches. So rather than only linguistic aspects, we are also giving a psychological aspects also. But one important component is also missing, that we don't give importance here extra linguistic components, extra linguistic properties which are mixed up. The interlanguage concept is not only important in development of internal grammar system of students, but it is also for other concepts of language. We can extend this whole model to understand the other components of the language which are actually embedded in the system. It also focuses the consequences of the concept of teachers and the works in SL language classrooms. How the teachers will react, interact, or play the roles, that is also taken into consideration in this model. Due to findings of cognitive linguistics in L1 acquisition, a notion is developed in second language learning to claim that learners actively construct rules from the data they encounter and gradually adopt these rules in direction of the target language. This is the most important findings for us. A new shift in understanding the whole process that we learn that learners not only assimilate the rules of the second language in the whole process of learning, rather they also construct some rules of their own, which they utilize, and they construct those rules with the level of data they are exposed to. Learners also produce wrong and improper sentences as a part of the learning, which in regard to the TL system are grammatical in their own terms, since they are the products of learners' own language system. It's not error. This system gradually develops towards the rule-based systems of target language. Now, the impact, after the impact, we have the triumph of the intermediate. Now, perhaps the last slide, it says that interlanguage theory has a triumph. It has been successful, not because of it's all proof, absolutely safe theory, but The triumph is that it paves out a new way, new approach, new direction, new pattern of thinking in the whole process of learning. That is why the importance of the interlanguage, that it leads us to think, okay, there is another way we can think of the entire process of learning and find out new avenues to explore not only the process of learning, but also the entire cognitive process involved in language acquisition, processing, utilizations, and applications in various domains. The interlanguage theory is by far the strongest contender amongst the second language learning theories. This theory is the first major attempt to explain the complex process of SL learning in terms of mentalist perspectives. After the introduction of the theory by Celinca in 1972, it has gradually been modified and improved by many researchers. Now it is far more advanced than the prior stages. At several junctures, the theory has been much refined. Moreover, it has contributed in many different ways in developing many other theories also. It has been the platform or the ground on which the other theories are developed. In spite of being vague at many points, the interlanguage theory has been successful to provide significant suggestions for generation of new theories of second language learning. So this is perhaps the last slide. This is the references. So before I finish it, I will just refer to one important question that has been raised by Professor Stony, that is S.N. Sridhar from Stony Brook University, US. And we had a discussions with him also and some other scholars also. The most important that the importance of interlanguage has been measured or viewed from the perspective of second language learning. And we assume that learners are actually having a kind of bilingual framework, that mother language and second language. In these two situations, interlanguage works. Now, if I put the whole concept, whole frame into a larger frame, like situation, think of Indian context. In the context of multilingualism, when the learner is exposed to multilingual teaching or multilingual learning mechanism, or here in Indian cases, a trilingual language policy, when a particular stage, at the early stage of learning, a learner is simultaneously exposed to two new languages, say for a Bengali learner, Bengali being the mother tongue, the learner also learns English and Hindi simultaneously. In that particular multilingual frame, whether this interlanguage model will actually properly work, or we need to define a new frame of work, or new framework, or new model, new approach, or new strategy that is still to be explored. I'm really grateful to Professor S.N. Sridhar for sharing his articles with me and giving me an opportunity to think of that. If the conditions happens that many of the learners are actually exposed to multilingual situations, mother tongue based multilingual learning model, MLA model, and how the interlanguage frame will operate, that is still an open question. So with these things, with these ideas, I would like to finish here. We have 10 more minutes to left, and thank you once again, and thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much. I stop sharing here so that I can take your questions. Thank you. Santanu. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Nilatri. It was a very enthralling talk, and there are several points and questions that there have been raised
Yes.
by several people. I will set the ball rolling
Yeah.
by asking you a couple of one comment that has been put to me privately is that
Huh.
you have been talking about the stability versus the evolution and the dynamicity of the interlanguage process.
Yes.
So, whether do you see that there is this dynamicity will in any way affect the mental grammar, the state of mental grammar, or the stage of interlanguage uh, is understood? But how does this interface with the cognitive process? Say, for example, like a zone of proximal development, which is an
Hmm.
important concept in the pedagogical terms, where you
Yes.
challenge the learner to
Yeah.
speak up about and increase their repertoire.
Mhm.
So this is one comment that I would like from you, if you can throw some
See,
light on that.
yeah, sure. So this is a very important pertinent questions, because as I have already mentioned that the whole process of language learning, second language learning, this is a basically cognitive and psychological processes. And as we have Celinca's model, as already said, and as we have tried to understand that there are questions of two contradictory. There is a question of dynamicity in the whole process, and there is a question of stability in the other aspects. So when we talk about stability, just I'm giving a parallelism. Think of a chain. So it's a chain model. So when if you look at the multilingual, sorry, interlanguage acquisition continuum, you can find out that there are several blocks. So the shifting of the learning of the mechanism, learning process for the part of the learners actually shifts from stage one to stage two, phase two to four, to the final stage of learning. So this process is itself is dynamic. Otherwise, you cannot shift from early stage to beginner stage to intermediate stage to advanced stage to far more advanced stage until and it is earned. And in every stage, there are some components, some rules, some patterns which are assimilated by the learners, acquired by the learners because of the level of exposures they get to the second language. And these components being stable, until unless they are stable, you cannot construct the other levels of progress. So you have to understand that each block in a chain is a stable component. But the whole process, the movement of the chain is a dynamic one. So these two processes, as far as I have understood, are actually interlinked in this manner, that their stability, the each component or the rules they assimilate are more or less stable at certain point of time, because at the same time you must keep in mind that I have already said that these are stable as long as the new rules or new patterns are not observed. The moment you get a new pattern, the new rule, which actually contradicts your existing knowledge or a learner's patterns, the learner is exposed to realize or revise the whole pattern and have a new revised pattern, which is stable up to that point till he or she is exposed to another rule which contradicts the existing one. And these each component is basically as a block of a chain, which makes the chain dynamic to process in the whole process of learning. So both dynamicity as well as stability are actually two important criteria in the whole process of interlanguage continuum.
Thank you for this interesting interjection. And maybe a comment comes
Yeah.
from Dr. Anirban Haldar, who
Yes.
is a faculty member in the department. So he makes a comment in regards to the interlanguage continuum again
Yeah.
that you spoke about. So he shares a thought about, can linguistics or language acquisition training go hand
Hmm.
in hand with the literary studies? Because
Yes.
literature, as one sees, they animate various aspects of the social that comes to the impede the linguistic component. So your comments and thoughts about that.
I very much appreciate if there is some literary component in the whole process of language teaching. Because, let me tell you, I have already categorically said that learning a second language is not learning the grammar only or the vocabulary. Is learning the second language means you have overall confidence or competence using the language in all possible situations and environments a learner is exposed to. And having sufficient amount of exposure in literature adds new dimensions, which I've already mentioned once or twice, new dimensions in the whole process of the extra linguistic components. See, I learned a rule that this is a rule that has to be used. Say, I have learned that English doesn't make any discrimination with regard to the seniority. They have only single term you, whether the junior or senior or peer or something like that. So I can use the whole concept of you in a different, it's when I use my language. But if you think that you have a better understanding that even if there is no discriminations in the use at the lexical level, there are some other extra linguistic elements which are actually involved to mention the seniority or to indicate the seniority of the interactions, then perhaps a literary exposure to the literature or literary components of the target language can enrich the learners to have all the extra linguistic information about the discourse, at ecology, at a culture and heritage. That gives learner far better exposure, far better confidence, and far better competence in appropriate use of the language. So stylistics, figurative usages. Recently, I went through an article. It says very clearly that until and unless a second language learner is very much efficient using slangs in the second language, along with idiomatic expressions and proverbial expressions, we do not claim that the learner is very well equipped. And I fully agree with them, because I have noted when I was there in UK several times that my language is so formal to them, they don't feel comfortable. They say that, okay, the native language confidence is missing because you don't have the stylistic aspects. Some slangs, you don't use some slangs, or you don't use some extra linguistic properties or some discursive elements. So these are missing. So even if I speak English, I don't have that kind of confidence the native language speaker has. So if literature can give an exposure or give sufficient knowledge about those aspects, I would very much welcome that these texts should be. In fact, I know that some of the areas, particularly in Malaysia and China, I recently went through some articles, they have made that English language teaching, particularly in second language advanced level, a large amount of uh, literary text, standard literary text, is a part of the whole language process, learning process. And I appreciate that. And I think that that should be a part of the component, the whole scheme of second language learning. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Professor. Two related concepts.
Yeah,
One, you showed in the Corders model of interlanguage, and I think it was in the slide 17 or 18,
yeah.
the continuum.
Hmm.
So where you showed a unidirectional arrow. So does that mean it is only one directional, or can it go slide backwards?
Yes,
And
yes,
a
yes,
related,
yes, yes.
yes, a
Yeah.
related concept is, question is that, if all errors are not corrected,
Uh,
would not there be any chance to make the same kinds of mistakes for the learners again if they're not correct? And won't there be fossilization? So kind of two related concepts of going back and forth, as well as a fossilization
yes.
as a psychological process.
So this continuum model is not, I have already mentioned that this is not my model. I have borrowed from
Yeah.
some other sources to understand the thing. Since I was talking about that shifting of a learner from first language to second language, this is normally said one unidirectional, but at every stage there is a backward movement also, because that is mandated, that is bound to happen. Otherwise, you cannot make progress. So there are
Right.
situations that you have to go back a step backwards to recharge yourself with new rules so that you can move little more further. So that is
Yes,
first.
like kind of like the proverbial monkey
Yes,
climbing
yes,
that bamboo stick
yeah, yeah.
and sliding back after,
Yes, yes, yes.
kind of.
And what was your second observation?
So the second one was relating to whether this might lead to some certain degree of fossilization if the errors are all errors are not corrected.
No, 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 no. All errors cannot be corrected, because see, every learner, if we correct all the errors on the part of the learners, then the whole creativity that is involved or generativity involved in the part of the learners will be crippled. So learners themselves can also identify that they have some errors. They have made some errors when they communicate with the native language speakers, and they have the mechanism to correct some errors by themselves. So two things are there. There are some errors, the learners don't know that they have made those errors. So that needs to be identified and corrected. But there are some errors which learners themselves know that this is a mistake I have made. So he knows that third person singular number, present indefinite tense, the verb should carry a S. So he goes or she goes and they go. But if I say I goes, I know that I have made a mistake.
But
But
still, he
next
can't
time,
help it.
but she can help because of insufficiency in training. But next time, I can have that kind of my inbuilt mechanism can help me to rectify that error. When I, as a learner, I'm conscious that I have made an error and it's not accepted in my target language, I can make this error. But if I say that I do not know how to make distinction between, say, two similar pronounced words or homophonous words, I make mistakes, but I don't know that, I'm not aware that I have made a mistake. That kind of errors needs rectification on the part of the native speakers or learners. See, I have mentioned that I failed to use those slangs in their language. My native speakers from England, they said that, oh boy, you made some grave mistakes. What? No, you don't use that particular term here. We use this term. So because I don't have that exposure, I don't know. That's a real error. But if I address some lady as he or a gentleman as she, then I know that I made a mistake. So I can rectify that one. So it is not necessary that all the mistakes on the part of the learners should be rectified. So learners themselves are also equipped. They have that kind of capacity to correct certain errors, and that errors don't need to be rectified.
The kind of dovetails with the monitor model by Stephen Krashen
Mhm.
in some sort of way.
Yeah.
So one more comment by Dr. Haldar is that would it be possible to make some comments about the more recently developed theories with regard to interlanguage, or some new evidence which kind of supports or goes against
That
these
is
theories?
possible. That is possible also, particularly classes model and essentials model that has been asked. But since I have already stayed in my title of my talk, that is basically I'm emphasizing on Celinca's model of interlanguage, the basic concepts. So maybe in the next talk, because there are many issues involved into it, many recent criticisms, also critical theories, that can be addressed in a different matter or different platform, not here.
Yeah, so we can initiate a conversation with regard to that
Yeah.
and move
Yes. Yes.
forward
Yes. Yes.
offline or something.
Yes.
So, so I think there are quite some more, but we have all good things come to an end, and
Thank you. Really.
so we have to be very particular about certain things. So
Yeah.
I will share a feedback form with you, and
Hmm.
since
Sure.
a lot of people have asked, and in the meantime, so we can hope that if there are one or two more comments or questions, Dr. Dash can answer them.
Yes. Yes.
So feel free. Just give me a minute to share the form with you.
Yes. Yeah.
So here is the link for the feedback form,
Yeah.
and I think now it is there.
Is
So
it
you can,
shared? I can't
yeah, it
see.
is. So it is. I just shared in the chat box
Acha.
with the. So it's a Google form where you
Hmm.
can just people can just go and feedback, so that we can improve in our next series, and how you have liked it, and whether you would like to have more such interactions.
Oh, it is for
And
all participants, right?
yeah, it is for all participants. So there might be other things that would have inspired some of the participants, but
Mhm.
because of the paucity of time, they may not have been able to ask, or maybe some other reasons. In any case, so for every good thing comes to an end. So I take this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks for the event. At first, I thank Professor Dr. Niladri Sekhar Dash from ISI Kolkata for accepting our invitation and delivering this wonderful lecture on interlanguage, the basic concepts and understandings. I thank the Vice Chancellor of Akal University, Professor Gurmail Singh, for his support, uh, Director IQAC, Professor Subjit Singh, who has supported these activities in all sorts of ways. And I thank our department staff, faculty, students, and the IT team, and of course the participants who have participated uh, in this wonderful lecture. And my special thanks to our chancellor, who has made all these things possible within the very short span of time. Thank you very much. Thanks. If you have any comments, feel free to reach out to us. And if you have any suggestions for speakers and further events, so please, we are open to suggestions. Thank you very much, and thanks, Professor Das, again for sparing time from a busy schedule and honoring us with your lecture.
Thank you very much. Uh, I'm really grateful to giving me an opportunity because I'm still a learner. I'm learning from all people, and if they
We
have any
all
good
are,
fact,
sir. We all are learners. We can't
so
claim to be anything else but that.
so
So,
anyway, so here it comes the formal ending of the session, or I should wait for any talk or any comments. It's vote of thanks is
I
done.
think there are no comments
So
right now. So I think it is a formal end.
ends.
But you are too humble, sir, to accept that you are one of the leading luminaries
No,
in
no,
the
no, no,
field
not that, not that.
in India and abroad, and
I'm just a
everybody
servant.
knows you in the field, especially in the computational area and the morphology and computer assisted all
Language.
things. So it is. Only a few days back, I think 2 or 3 days back, you gave a special lecture at Punjabi University.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So that was on the technology development of Indian languages based on that. So it was wonderful to hear you there as well. And so
Thank you.
formally we come to the end of today's program. And thanks once again to everyone.
So thank you, everybody. Stay safe. My regards and my prayers to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Good night. A good day. Have a good day.